Okay, so we're going to get started since this is a precious time. I'm going to do a real quick introduction, and then we'll get into our conversation. So, welcome everyone to what we're calling Author Conversations with Churches for the Sake of Others, a Diocese of the Anglican Church. And my name is Jin Cho, and I have the privilege of leading our diocesan office for race and justice. And before I introduce our esteemed guest, uh, obviously everyone can see that we are recording this event, and our plan is to use it as a resource on our website, but also to eventually release it as a podcast that we have been working on, this podcast series that we've been working on for a long time. We've been planning for a long time. Our format today is a conversation. I did not ask Kathy to prepare a lecture or lead a workshop or preach to us or anything like that, but rather to simply to be with us in her wisdom. So this is a conversation. So in the first half, I will ask some questions to get us going, but then I would love to invite everyone to join in on the conversation with whatever questions that you might want to ask. I first encountered Kathy through her book, Raise Your Voice, Why We Stay Silent and How to Speak Up, which I read during the pandemic. And I was struck by Kathy's ability to name things that I had been feeling, that I'd been wanting to name myself, but I didn't know how to name. And then the courage and the power with which she spoke as she encouraged all of God's people, whether we have formal authority or not. And that was, I thought, was really something different, really different. Whether you have formal authority or not, she encouraged all of God's people to use our voice. And I've since listened to Kathy on various podcasts, read her blog. So I do feel like I have, even though we just met, I feel like I have a little bit more of a informational advantage over her. But when a mutual friend mentioned that he could connect us, I jumped at the chance. So this is what we have. Kathy has since co-authored another book entitled Loving Disagreement, Fighting for Community Through the Fruit of the Spirit, which helps us to think about disagreements in the church, not as something to avoid, but as something that can be transformative. So, Kathy, thank you so much for joining us. Can you tell us a little bit about your background and maybe how you came to be this catalyst for courageous conversations about justice?
Oh, goodness. So I grew up in the Chicago suburbs. I am the daughter of immigrants and technically an immigrant myself. I came to the US when I was 8 months old. And my husband and I have been talking a lot about our childhood memories. And I bring that up because I actually have no memories of kindergarten.
Hmm.
And he has very strong memories of kindergarten. I have some vague memories of first grade, but I think my clearest memories start in second grade. And I have this very unscientific theory in that my first language was Korean. And so when I started public schools in Chicago, I could not speak the language, I could not communicate. So I think I probably spent a good chunk of my kindergarten year terrified and trying to figure
Hmm.
out what was happening. So I find that interesting because fast forward, before I went into vocational ministry, I was a newspaper reporter for about 5 years. And one of the few times my dad said in front of a large crowd that he was proud of me, he was talking about the fact that his daughter was going to be a newspaper reporter reporting in English in a language she did not know when she started school. That is what
Hmm.
he said. And so I think a lot about that and the formation of a sense of voice in a very literal sense of
Hmm.
how to try to find the words to express the experiences, the questions, the concerns that we have, and then what form and shape that takes. So I was a newspaper reporter. I've been a writer my entire life, and went into vocational ministry, left that scene after 20 some years. I was there up until about 2019. February of 2019. So I missed ministry and COVID, that huge pivot that many of you may have experienced firsthand in trying to shift from a physical space to a virtual space. And so, again, I think a lot about what it means to communicate and what it means to have relationship when for a significant chunk of time we could only relate virtually and then
Mm.
we were connecting across time zones and continents in ways that I don't think many of us were doing on a consistent basis before COVID. So, Raise Your Voice, that was a number of years ago, and then Loving Disagreement, and both books came around during tumultuous political times. And people have often said, wow, the timing of your books have been amazing. And I'm like, yeah, no, did not plan that. Did not plan that, but I'm really pleased and honored to join you all.
I was going to actually say that you seem to have this spiritual gift of timing because Raise Your Voice came out like 2018,
Yep,
like late 2018,
yep,
and Loving Disagreements came out last year.
yep.
And I might describe both of these, the book topics, as a sort of calling out of the church and what it is not doing well. Um, and I'm curious what made you want to step into dealing with these difficult conversations when so many
Yeah.
churches and when so many Christians are falling back again into this mode of avoiding difficult conversations.
Yeah. So I would say that part of my desire, and I would like to reframe it and say I'm trying to call in and
Mm,
invite churches and the people of God into deeper conversations around the issues and the topics that actually mean a lot to us on our daily basis. And I think that all came about in my development as a newspaper reporter. So, high school journalism, you have to learn about all sorts of things that you actually care nothing about,
mm,
and then try to find something that the reader might relate to. And then I took that into the work of being a professional, a newspaper reporter, and finding that the stories I was assigned or the beats I was assigned to weren't necessarily the areas of my expertise or my interest. And so then you have to learn how to ask questions, how to be curious, how to really approach other people not as subject matter, but as your neighbors. So, why should I care about what this community cares about? And then, why does the community next door, why should they care about what's going on in this neighboring community? And so, I think that combined with my faith, which has always kind of pushed me into asking, what does it mean to belong in God's family and be a part of community? Because my experiences were so different as a child growing up in the Korean immigrant church, and how I felt and didn't feel welcomed in different Christian spaces. And so I think
mm,
all
mm,
of those factors combined allowed me to observe a lot and form my words carefully and decide when or if God was inviting me to do or say something, whether or not I wanted to. So I would say that this, the topics of the two books and kind of my presence on social media and the things that I get involved with aren't just because I am angry at injustice. It is because I feel very compelled as a Christian to say to other Christians, this is not the way it is supposed to be.
mm.
This is not what God is inviting us to. How do you interpret community? How do you live into God's invitation into community and church? What does that look like? Because I am not so sure it's supposed to look like this. So, I don't always enjoy it. So I think that's the other thing, is that if people only know me from what I put out on social media, they're not seeing all of the internal wrestling. They don't see the close group of friends. Some people call that, your personal board of directors. Um, they don't see the hand wringing that I do and the praying that I do, and then kind of okay, this is God's invitation to me. Let's use this opportunity to point out this injustice, to ask this question of my other Christians out there, to ask of my readers, is is this really what we think it should look like? And if we agree that no, it should look better, how can we work towards that, even if we don't agree on everything?
Yeah, that's thank you so much. That's so good because you're pointing out like one of the things that I notice is that when we talk about like what does it mean for us to have a loving disagreement or work through and have hard conversations, um so often people walk in not curious but assuming they know what it's supposed to look like and what even a good version or a bad version is supposed to look like. And then we kind of put that on top of even the conversation itself, that so that you can't even get into the conversation.
Right.
Um, eh, I'm thinking particularly about when somebody thinks about even speaking up. Um, there's this spiritual tone policing that happens immediately,
Yes.
right? It's like it's fine to speak the truth, but you should always speak the truth in love, and it's never quite in love, or it was something that they have in mind. So speak a little bit more because like I think you're talking about some practices as well as your reflection, self-reflection that goes into the work of speaking the truth boldly and at the same time creating this space so that there is a conversation and inviting others to join in on that conversation.
Yeah. And I mean, I say this often. I don't speak about this or write about this as an expert. I made sure in both books that there are examples of where I failed, where I'm still
Mhm.
learning, where I'm like, I could have done this differently. And that continues, one, because the world continues to change, our churches continue to change, the language around these issues changes. Um, but really, it's hard because as Christians, I think we run into the danger of spiritualizing or using spiritual language in situations when we are uncomfortable, right? So
Mm,
very specifically, as people of faith, when we say things like, "Well, you should speak truth in love," we have a very specific idea of what that sounds like when somebody else is delivering the message,
mm,
right? Truth in love. If it's going to be uncomfortable, I want you to lean heavily on love. And really, do I mean I want you to lean heavily on polite or nice, right? Because truth is not always nice and it's not always comfortable. Um, in the church, we use the metaphor of marriage quite often. And so I warned my husband early on that he was marrying a writer. And so our life's work would become an example. So even in our marriage, right, we could say to each other, honey, I want you to speak, you know, in love as you're like, we're talking about our conflicts. And really what we're saying is like, I don't want to be hurt.
mm,
I don't want to feel like I failed you. I don't want to feel like a disappointment. And and I think what I have learned over 30 years of marriage and writing and being a Christian for longer than that is um, we have not been equipped well to understand and hold our own discomfort in the company of others so that we can have these difficult conversations. I think a lot about growing up as a child of immigrants, and my mom often says things like, life is just suffering. She's so optimistic. you know, life is just suffering. And so sometimes you hold it. 참어. You just hold it. And it's not you forget it, but you hold it and you live so that you can still relate to other people. Because if you're only working out of that suffering, you're projecting that elsewhere. And so when I think about all that's going on in the world right now, there's a lot of suffering and there's a lot of things happening on social media. You can feel it. I don't know about you, but I can feel it. I scroll through and I'm like, whoa, whoa. And I choose not to react right away. I have to step back and be like, oh, what is this person communicating? What is hurting them so much? Why is this issue so painful? What
Mm,
are they trying to say with these images, these words, this post, this conversation? Recognize what's happening in my own soul and body. Take a minute, several minutes, and then choose to engage.
mm. W- What what has helped you through, I mean, so 2018 is when Raising Your Voice came out, and you've obviously have been engaging these with this topic and subject with people, and now you're sort of a public figure, and there's a lot of and that's a hard space. That's such a hard space. Um, what I mean, and for you to continue to do this and not say, as I shared with you early on, it's like this is hard work to be in and day out. There are days in which you just go, I don't want to do this anymore. For myself, that's me talking. um what has what are the practical ways in which people can um be willing and wanting to step back in, even though they're going to get that email, they're going to get that pushback, they're going to get that weird conversation with somebody after you say this one line in a sermon of like
Yeah.
40 minutes, Um, what has helped you? What has sustained you? What is something that you might be able to say that might be helpful for us?
Well, I think, when we had talked earlier that the desire, like, oh, on these days I want to quit or run away or just stop this. Um, I think back a lot to one of my spiritual directors, and that's where I get this sense of what is God's invitation to you. And so, for those of you who are in vocational ministry, this was an invitation that you sensed from God, and you said yes, and you trusted God, even though you were like, well, but I also have these 5 questions for you. And I think that is the same approach that I have with my space out there as a public figure and my that public work there, that I tell people not everyone is called to do it in the same way,
Mm,
right? Not everyone is called into full-time vocational ministry. Not everyone is called to part-time or volunteering in vocational ministry. Not everyone is called and invited, or should say yes, to posting every thought they have on social media. But when you have said yes to an invitation, what I have found that consistently sustains me after all of these years is I do have a trusted group of friends who have journeyed with me for 20 some years. And they have seen various iterations of Kathy, like pre-therapy Kathy, um, mom of three children, two are still in diapers, Kathy. Uh, they have seen and walked with me in times pre-social media. I also recognize that not everybody has the gift of that kind of long-term relationship. Um, but for others I know who do similar work and others who are in ministry, they have a close group of friends who are not necessarily in the same space.
Mm,
So that has also sustained me. Most of my close friends here in my neighborhood are not, they don't watch what I do. Most of them aren't even Christians. They are not impressed with what I do. They are not afraid of what they like. It's not important, but they know me as a human being. And so, do you have those people who know you outside of your role,
mm,
who can talk you out of church talk or Anglican talk or ministry talk? And can they get to some of the other things that are going on in your life? So that has sustained me. That keeps me grounded. That keeps me honest. Um, I have a number of physical kind of practices that keep me grounded in my body and present in wherever, whatever space. So I'm also a yoga teacher. That's taught me a lot about my breath, about how I'm carrying myself, what I'm feeling in my body, and given me the awareness of being able to watch other people and read a little bit and be able to ask questions when I'm in a hard conversation. And I watch my husband drop his head and I'm like, oh, that I don't know what that is, but that's something. So,
mm, mm,
I'll ask instead of getting angry that he's not paying attention. So that practice of remembering that I'm a human and that I have a physical body and I'm not just a soul. What are those practices?
mm,
What do you do? I have observed, especially in the last 10 years, that folks in vocational ministry, some of us are the most unhealthy people. There's a lot of time sitting, you're prepping for sermons, you're on a desk, you're on your gadget, your computer, um, and the ones who are going to be healthy over the long haul have some sort of hobby. They know what is fun for them, and laughter, because this work of justice is not funny.
mm,
It is hard, it is ugly, it is depressing, it is discouraging. And so I make sure I laugh
mm,
and have fun and am able to also experience joy. And close friends have noticed when I'm just angry, Kathy, and that is not a healthy, that's not a healthy me.
mm.
When I only experience injustice and communicate that out and lack the ability to see God working in joyful, beautiful, mysterious ways. Um, so, friends, some sort of physical practice, getting out of your office, moving your body, um, a hobby, something that brings you joy and fun. Because I think hobbies can be fun, but sometimes our hobbies become work, or maybe that's just me. But something that's like totally unrelated to producing anything,
Yeah.
just having fun. Yeah.
Yeah, that's so good. No, I'm so totally goal oriented, even in my hobbies. Um, I don't do them otherwise. I'm like, I gotta get something, work towards something.
Yeah.
I also feel seen that you called out like uh preparing for sermons as like this really awful on your body, because I think
Hmm.
I realized that a little while back that I'm like, a, I need to visit my chiropractor after
Yeah,
preparing for too many sermons in a row.
yeah,
So yeah,
yeah.
it's a real thing. Let's turn a little bit more toward Loving Disagreement, this book that is so apt for our times. When one hears that phrase, loving disagreement, I think most of us, um, if we're actually not avoiding conflict, we might think of it more in terms of civility and politeness. But you and your co-author Matt, you guys say something completely different, that it's more than that, much more than that. So, uh, can you speak a little bit about that, what you mean by loving disagreement and
Yeah.
how that might be helpful?
Well, I mean, we had fun with the title. I believe it was I think it was our editor, Caitlin, who came up with the title, Loving Disagreement. So it's a little bit of a play on words. Um, it's the like, do you love disagreement? No, it's not loving. I don't, it's not about loving disagreement. Or can you be loving in your disagreement? And initially, we were approached about a book about civility, and I think it was understanding the political and social times that we happen to be in, and all this talk about being fractured and that kind of stuff. And so, um, what does it look like for Christians to be civil? And Matt and I both were like, if that is the bar for Christians, that is a low bar.
Mm,
And understanding that, I think because of the power of social media, um, we are often not civil, we are not kind, uh, and that was the leaning towards that initial idea. But really, when Matt and I sat down, we talked about, where is there a framework for us to talk about how to be with one another and know one another and get to know and care for one another. And what does that look like? And we're like, well, hopefully it's in the Bible. Hopefully God has something to say about this. And we agreed that maybe the fruit of the Spirit might be a framework for us to approach disagreement, because it's not just about being polite. It's really about understanding what it means to be transformed by the Holy Spirit. And so this
mm,
applies
mm,
to just more than disagreement, right? Like, this is the way we are supposed to show up in the world, period. And then we laughed because we both talked about, like, well, like, how many sermons, is there a sermon that you've heard in the last 5 years about the fruit of the Spirit that just knocked your socks off? And I keep copious notes and was like, I don't I don't know if I've heard a sermon series about the fruit of the Spirit that also addressed disagreement.
mm.
And so that's
Yeah.
kind of where we sat down and we're like, oh, maybe we'll learn something. And we did. It wasn't fun writing this book.
Say more about that. What was so hard? What was not fun? Yeah.
Well, we looked at the fruit of the Spirit, and it was a lot like a sermon prep, right? We started, like, for me, and Matt too, we're reading different different versions of scripture. We're looking into the original language and kind of digging deep and going, oh, I don't want to write about this fruit because I don't, I'm not this. And so, as we were looking at the fruit of the Spirit, there were a few that Matt and I were immediately drawn to. And then there were a few where we each were like, can you write about this? Because this is really hard for me. Like,
Mm,
I don't want to do this. And as a writer, um, it when you write a book, there's like a physical reminder of what you wrote, and that lives on. And so I think there was a moment, many moments of fear of, like, oh, I'm going to write about this. And then now, every time I post something on social media, I have to remember I just wrote a book about patience. And what does that look like when I show up in the world now that I've
Mm,
put these words out there? And I think that was continues to be a great reminder for me and Matt is that I think as Christians, we say we are being transformed, but there isn't this kind of accountability
mm,
that we necessarily feel and experience in that way. Matt and I definitely have, we've joked about it quite a bit with one another, like, oh yeah, that thing that I just posted, it took me like 4 days to decide how I wanted to write it and what I wanted to post.
yeah. Oh, the pressure. It's like preaching a sermon that people remember.
Yes, yes, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, it's so good. Um, I want to just uh, allow for people to begin to chime in and ask questions if you have thoughts as we're continuing to talk about loving disagreement or even any of the other parts that we've talked about. I'm wondering if people have any thoughts or questions or comments that you might want to share. I could keep going.
I'll just, well, just the, again, thanks, Kathy, for being here. Like, it triggered when you said about like you just wrote the book. Now you have to be careful about what you say because now you're representing what you wrote in that sense. And I remember wearing my collar in public for the first time, and I'm big. I'm 6'8", and if I'm thinking, my face shuts down, and I just look like a big mean guy. So I just remember walking around like I have to be careful, like the look on my face, because I'm representing, like I have a collar on. I'm representing a, a people group, or in a sense, or I'm an ambassador for Christ in that sense. So I distinctly remember that of who am I representing to the community. The other thing I thought about when you were talking was working as a retail manager, this phenomenon of people trying to have a disagreement, like when they came in to say, I'm not happy with my product. And I could watch people walk from the parking lot and they would have to, I could watch them get up the emotional energy to say,
Right.
I'm not happy. And
Mm,
because I'm going to be, it's a confrontation. And well, one of my salespeople said, well, you only diffuse that conversation because you're 6'8", and they're not going to argue with you. But if I just like if I welcome that person in, like you said, as I treat them like a person with they're bothered by something, and they might look like they're unhappy with me, but like to say like how once I can diffuse that by saying I want to hear you, I want to hear what you have to say, and even if we don't agree on it, but it really diffuses the situation for uh, treating that person like a person that and their energy. I can watch them go out, leave them, so we can
Yeah,
actually have a conversation. I don't know if you want to
yeah.
speak on that, of what you've seen on that.
that's good.
Well, I'm the opposite. I'm 5'3" on a good morning, and I'm also a Korean American woman. And so people have stereotypes of what they expect the interaction to be.
Mm,
And so what I have found is folks are surprised. They're very surprised that, um, especially when they've only read what I put out and they've not met me in person. And so they're trying to imagine what this person will be like. And when I am there in person, it's the same. So my writing voice is the same as my speaking voice, and then I bring that same energy um, into the physical space. And for some people, they're like, "Whoa, that is not what I expected." And then that's an invitation. That's an opportunity to ask. So what were you expecting, and what are you feeling right now? And um, uh, what is uncomfortable? Is there something that I can adjust, or is that something that you're adjusting in terms of your understanding of who I am as a person? Um, I think about congregations, and I think it is one of those. I can't imagine being a pastor, a priest, where you have to preach every week unless you have somebody filling your pulpit. And I don't know about any of your churches, but I know the churches that I have been in, there are always one or two people in the congregation, and you can tell like they're just waiting for the end of the service to make a beeline to the pastor or the worship leader because they have some thoughts. And right, it's the same, Chris, as you were saying, you can see somebody from the parking lot. And I think uh, that there should be more work done in seminaries in helping folks in ministry to kind of receive that, not absorb it, but to kind of receive and make space for that. And for us to be able to do the work to recognize what is it that somebody else said that is triggering or activating in something in me, and being able to name that, because I think that's also a lot of those points of confusion and disagreement and not seeing or understanding each other is because I can't read my husband's mind, although sometimes I can. That if I assume something is happening, I'm usually incorrect. And so I'm assuming a disagreement, and I'm assuming the point of that disagreement. I actually don't know. And so I
Mm.
think a lot of times in our relationships, whether it's in church, outside of church, in our families, we are having an entire conversation in our heads about what we're disagreeing on, and we actually don't know.
Mm.
We don't know.
That's a great thing about, like, I'm trained in internal family systems therapy. That model it is, how to be aware of the parts inside of me that are being activated, that are
Mm-hmm.
being like, when we're not taught that in seminary
Mm-hmm.
about pastoral care or just interacting with other people. But part of the big part of the training is what's called a U-turn, like to say, like, what's going on in me when I'm hearing
Yep.
this person talk, so that I can be aware of, like, oh, I have some parts that are being activated by that. I need to ask them to step aside so I can be calm, curious, confident, compassionate. So yeah, that's a great point about just being aware of what's going on inside myself.
Yeah. And for those who aren't familiar with that language, activation is another word used for triggering. And
Mm.
triggering has uh, ended up with its own negative connotations, much like other words in our vernacular now. But it is really like, what is it that, like, what something you hear, or a situation that you're in, or even a smell or a sound can activate something in your body. And it can be a good or bad thing or a neutral thing. Um, but we need to be aware of that so that as we're engaging with other people, we know how we're holding ourselves in the conversation. And so if you're activated and you're up here, you might not actually be listening to the person right in front of you.
Well, that's so good because so many of these conversations are about or are difficult conversations by nature because
Mm-hmm.
somebody just they don't see what you see, or and so this has to be a gap that needs to be crossed. And of course, it's going to be emotional. And then not knowing how you respond to emotions. I've seen people shut down just because they
Yes.
see somebody being passionate about something, and then they see that as something negative, or they read judgment into it. And instead of continuing to be curious about, like, what was it about me? What that makes me react like that to somebody
Mm-hmm.
being passionate, or um, those kind of emotional cues that we are sometimes very unaware about, especially about ourselves.
Right. Right.
Other people who might want to jump in or comments or thoughts?
All right. Hi, Kathy. So you started to touch on this even, I think, a little bit even in response to what Chris had to say. But one of the things that, um, yeah, I'm curious about, and I'm really glad to see that there are a few women on this call, and just in some of the roles that I play in our diocese, is that there is just like when we're talking about like harder conversations, engaging in them, and then like women leading. There are just these like interesting things, right, that we face that our brothers do not. And so I just am curious, like what encouragement you might offer. And you even hit on some of like the cultural pieces, right? So for you,
Yeah.
like as an Asian woman, you're going to experience things differently than I do as a Black woman.
Yes.
And so I'm
Yes.
aware, like when I walk into a space of the stereotypes, when I get ready to say something that someone may have, and those look pretty different, right, than they would for you. And I think then there's like these layers, right? Like women generally, if we're in places, where we're speaking, especially to harder topics, even that moment of like a pause of being really selective, like what do we say, what don't we say, concern around how we may activate others, kind of all of that. Just curious how you might offer encouragement, I think specifically for women who have been called by the Lord to this work, and especially the pressing in on harder topics.
Yeah. There are so many things. I am grateful for the mentors that I had in ministry, both men and women, who I could have really honest conversations about how challenging ministry was in my body, in my personhood, and then especially gathering other women. So for the women on the call, it's a little twofold. I would say for me, the most important space for me was to find other Asian American women. And then the second most important space was women of color. I will be very honest here. What I found less helpful were kind of the multi-ethnic with white women spaces, with white women who were not doing any learning on their own about race, culture, and ethnicity. Because in those spaces, then I felt like I had to carry a lot of the education, and I am tired. I'm tired because it's hard enough to be a woman in ministry, right? And then you have to do all of this other stuff. And so I found it really helpful when white women, white men have their conversations and then come into more multicultural, multi-ethnic spaces, having done some work, having made some mistakes in their friendship circles. Because I don't, in my kind of ministry or official space, want to be that person. So for the women, find your people. And one of the greatest things, the icing, if there was an icing on the cake of COVID, was that all of a sudden it was very normal to get together with people on Zoom. And we weren't doing like hardly any of that. And so it became very normal to hop on a call, to FaceTime with a group of people, to have a text thread that goes on and on and on. And so find your people, just like I said earlier about kind of sustaining yourself in ministry. So find your people. And those people may change over time depending on your life stage, your season, your ministry, all of that. And uh, and and I have again a group of diverse women who include white women who have no qualms at all about calling me in. And I think that helps me because it's very easy to feel my anger and weariness. I mean, it's 2024 and I look at November and I'm like, I don't like this. I don't want to be here. I will say one of the sweetest things about being a woman in kind of ministry spaces, even though I'm not in vocational ministry, is that um, we we are a unique bunch of folk who love Jesus and have said yes to an invitation when, even if your denomination says you're welcome, hasn't figured it out, and you still say yes. And I think that that is such a beautiful, amazing thing because it sets in motion um, ministry for other generations. And I think about that quite a bit. I can't believe that it has been all of these years, and I have mentors who are in their 70s, and they didn't think, oh, here are these people still doing these things and they still love Jesus. Like that's the case. They still love Jesus. Um, don't forget, you also hold power. We also hold quite a bit of power as women. Um, and sometimes it looks different. It can be soft power. And so I encourage women to recognize, you know, what is it that we're doing that we're more like Queen Esther and going behind the scenes and arranging these side conversations that don't need to be upfront. But then when do you need to then go up front and say the thing and say yes to leadership or put yourself out there for a role that is out there as opposed to, you know, the dinner parties on the side. And then find men who are not who have done their work and are not intimidated by strong women. And that, I am so disappointed at how hard that can be. I think if social media, there was that whole thing about if you are hiking alone in the woods, you're a woman hiking alone in the woods, would you rather run into a bear or a man? So if you don't know what I'm talking about, you can Google it. It's a whole thing on social media a couple weeks ago. It's still there. And so many women said bear. Why? Because if a bear attacks you, people will believe you that the bear attacked you. But if a man attacks you, right? It's a whole nother story. But then when women were posting that they would rather meet a bear, my heart just sank at the number of men who were like, what do you mean? You've never met a bear. You're not talking about all men. I mean, it was very interesting to see the response. And again, I think my disappointment and my sorrow is that Christian men don't necessarily show up that much better.
Hmm.
And that's why, again, circling back to a question earlier, civility isn't enough, but for women to find ways, engage in that, be disappointed in that, be sad in that, but then also say, no, we need to keep telling men, I would rather meet a bear than one of you on a solo hike, and here is why. And you specifically may not be that man to do that thing, but then I need you to teach the men not to be that kind of man or to ask other men those questions. And then women, again, I love being a woman. I love being a woman. I love how my body is complicated in ways that science has not deemed important to study. I love that my body is in tune with a cycle that men find maybe dirty and disgusting. And I relish in the fact that that is something holy. And so, in all of the messages we get specifically as women about who we are, our bodies, and how that connects to our spiritual life, I want to encourage you and say, actually, If we are open and asking questions, it actually puts us so much in tune with God, the creator, in ways that seminary is not going to teach you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I and I think you're really calling out the fact that even in these sorts of conversations, it's not equal work, that it's not neutral. Like it doesn't matter where we're coming. We come in with our stories, and there's unequal work, whether it's gender, whether it's race, ethnicity. So yeah, I think yeah, that was really, really good. We have our work. We all have our work. And I think I might just kind of push that we all have work, that we all need to have that conversation. And I think I would encourage I have dear white brothers who encourage and say, I need you to speak to white men about white men and women and white spaces in ways that I can't. And of course I have certain power in being able to speak in my spaces with certain people of color. Um, thank you so much.
Yeah. I mean, it's the month of our people, Jin, right? Like
Mm,
it's Asian American, Native, Hawaiian, Pacific Islander Heritage Month. And again, it's so fascinating to me uh, what people do and do not know, what is and isn't taught, and that it was as recent as the 1950s where I could not have applied for US citizenship. That's not that long ago. And so what does that mean to have a heritage month and leading a church in any capacity?
mm,
And I would say, oh, well, find out what your church, your denomination has done or has not done. What was going on in the church during Japanese internment and World War II? I mean, that's always this big question in my mind. Like, literally, American citizens hauled off to camp. And I keep thinking, what was going on? What kind of Sunday sermon happened on those Sundays?
mm,
Right?
yeah.
As people just watch their neighbors leave. Did you leave Sunday and then decide you were going to go take over somebody's house or business?
Mm,
I'm speechless. And so I think that again, um, it the disagreements can often happen because we don't know. There is information that is unavailable to us. And so how will we learn that from one another and then learn on our own? And I really hope that in the next few months, church leaders do a better job in helping folks engage in conversations around things we don't like to talk about:
mm,
politics, money, women's bodily autonomy, um, all those conversations, because uh, I I think if church leaders don't, and you all opt to check out or opt out, hoping that there's another opportunity, um, we we will have missed an invitation from God
yeah.
to
Yeah.
really be present in the world.
Yeah. It's stunning because like I think the assumption sometimes is that we think, well, if we don't talk about it, then it will go away. But
Right.
what happens when we don't lead our congregations in this is that they just assume the positions and the framework of what they watch on TV, what the news feeds give them, and then they bring that in. And so, and everybody's talking nowadays about how the church is becoming more and more polarized, and that middle space is thinning out so much. And it's kind of, what else would you expect? What else would you expect if we are not willing to do the hard work of helping people understand to step in?
Right,
So,
right. Yeah. Yeah. Well, we also weren't called to be lukewarm water, right? So like that there is that tension in that, which is, oh, you know, I get why culturally my mom wants me to drink room temperature water. That's not my favorite. Jen knows. So that's not my favorite. And so I think again into scripture and God's invitation to us is yeah, we are all in churches and denominations that happen because there was schism and, and division and breakup. And so that happens. It's not the end of the world. It's not going to, look bad on God. We shouldn't really worry so much about looking bad on God in that way, but to be clear about things that you should be asking questions about, right? Not, you don't have to decide what people should believe, but you most certainly can invite people to be asking questions about X, Y, and Z. And when people say church should not be political, I say, well, there's a lot of policy involved with churches. You would hate to lose your tax deduction. You would hate to lose that protection.
mm,
Um, and so the church is political. It is involved in policy. Its existence is part of policy. And so what do we do with that? What is God's invitation to the church in that space?
love that language of invitation and curiosity. We are, gosh, already we're past the hour already. I'm wondering if anybody, I want to give anybody, somebody, whoever wants to take the last question or comment, quick one, possibly, and get that one in, just in case I didn't get a chance or you didn't
There's
get a
one in the
chance.
chat, Jen.
Okay, let's see. All right. So how do we have these conversations in the community? How do we have these conversations in the community outside of this meeting? And I
Good
think
luck.
yeah. How do we create safe spaces? How do we value like these things that you've been talking about just in like 30 seconds or less, Kathy? I don't want to keep you too long.
Yeah. So there's been a movement away from that language of safe spaces because we need to recognize that everyone coming into a conversation is risking something, right?
Mm,
We all hold
that's good.
power and we also have to give up some power. We're also risking being misunderstood, all of those dynamics. And so I think the language is shifting. I know some people are like, more language, courageous spaces, right? And
Mm,
in entering and then having an agreement. So there are all sorts of models. You can look up templates online around community agreements and
mm,
really agreeing that these are the terms of the conversation. There are different models that you can have. Some groups, they've passed on like a physical talking stick, and so you're not interrupting each other, right? So you're agreeing into certain dynamics where people have equal opportunity to ask questions and to respond. um, so there are different models out there, and I think that again, churches do not need to rely on what you have done before.
mm.
And a lot of these great conversations are unfortunately happening outside of the church space and in broader spaces. So look outside. You might be able to partner with some civic organizations, some other religious organizations and institutions uh, in your community might already be doing that work. And so I encourage people, the public library space is also a great place to see who is meeting and what they're talking about. And so that's another way to have these conversations, is to see who else is having conversations and what are they talking about, so that you don't recreate the wheel. You can individually or as a group from your church enter into a different space, give up some of your power as people who are planning and coordinating, and enter into a different space as well. Book pitch, you can also use one of the books as a guideline. Raise Your Voice has study questions at the end of every chapter. Loving Disagreement, we've just put together a discussion guide. Those are used more for individuals, but can be tweaked for a group setting. So if you're interested in that, let me know. We just are putting that together with the publisher. It's not out yet, but I can get that to you. Those are some of the recommendations I would have. And then start with a smaller group. You don't have to open it up to the whole congregation. That actually might be a bigger mistake. Can you have these conversations in a group of leaders? Can you have this group of this kind of conversation in a community group, a small group, whatever format that you're using in your church? Maybe you start 5-week, 4-week conversation on these 4 topics, and they can be the hottest button topics. You set the community agreement. You're deciding, you're not going to decide one side is right, one side is wrong. The understanding is that you're coming together to learn about each other and what you are disagreeing about.
Thank you so much. We've already gone over our time, and clearly we can chat for much longer. We've only just touched the tip of the iceberg. I appreciate everyone for making time to be with us, and we will definitely put this up on the website somewhere so that you could listen to some of the finer points afterwards as well. Kathy, thank you so much for being with us and being a friend to us and being speaking and doing. And you occupy a very it's a sliver of a space that not too many people are really stepping into. So thank you so much for doing that work. So appreciate all of you for joining us. Thank you.
Thank you.